This is an AMD A6 6400K released in 2013, and it is not the subject of today's video. Frankly, it's a weak AMD Pre-Ryzen dual core, so it's really not good enough to run almost any modern games. Instead, the focus of today's video will be its bigger brother, AMD's A8 6600K APU, a quad-core CPU and a decent integrated GPU all rolled up into one. Just don't confuse it for Intel's much stronger Core i5 of the same name. Anyways, for anywhere from $30 to $60 should you pick one up? Let's get the specs out of the way. It's a semi-quad core CPU, as in certain cores share resources, clocked up to 4.2 GHz, and that leaves a lot of headroom for overclocking, which should bring the chip's CPU performance from not good enough to acceptable. While the CPU performance is undoubtedly average, the star of the show for all AMD APUs is their strong integrated graphics. This particular APU features an HD 8570D graphics processor with 256 shader units and an 844 MHz clock speed. So let's investigate performance. Right off the bat, overclocking this processor is an absolute must. A modest overclock of 4.4 GHz and leaving the graphics clock speed untouched, all while using 8 GB of single-channel DDR3 1600, produces completely unplayable frame rates in most modern games. For example, GTA 5 runs with an average of just 18 FPS at 720p in low settings, while Dirt 4 runs at just 26 FPS at 720p in low. Bringing the CPU to 4.8 GHz and overclocking the graphics to 1013 MHz, as well as upgrading the RAM worked wonders for frame rate. Although not ideal, I've added another 2 GB to the pre-existing 8 GB for a total of 10 GB in dual channel, and I've overclocked all of the RAM to 1866 MHz. Now, most modern games are absolutely playable. Starting with the easier to run games, and do note that the recorded footage you see on the screen today is separate from actual gameplay. BioShock Infinite first. It runs at 47 FPS average with the occasional frame dip, all at 720p in low. You could even bump the resolution to 720p medium for this game and maintain a playable 30 FPS. However, 720p in low will be the theme for the rest of the benchmarks. Next up, Dirt 4 with the upgrades runs at 38 FPS, a huge increase from the previous 26. There's a little stutter, but it's overall a very good experience. CSGO runs flawlessly as it usually does, this time running at 65 FPS average at 720p in low. Excuse my horrible skills, but this game can even run at 40 FPS plus at 1080p, but if you care about FPS so you can rashbi suka harder, definitely leave it at 720p. Moving on, we have the must-have GTA 5. It runs well while driving around Los Santos and the surrounding countryside, hitting 34 FPS average with a small amount of stutter, mainly when a character wastes. Again, notice the huge improvement from 18 to 34 with some simple upgrades. Do be aware though that this game is heavily CPU bound, and driving too fast will cause some textures not to fill in fast enough, even with the CPU overclocked to 4.8 GHz as you may see on screen. Next up, the famously unoptimized GTA 4 runs just as well as its successor, hitting the same 34 FPS average at 720p in low, with a little more stutter during explosions and huge police chases. It does not max out the CPU or GPU in normal gameplay, unlike what you see on screen right now. These slower paced games are all completely playable at 30 FPS plus, making them a great match for this APU. Now moving on to games this APU cannot run. Rise of the Tomb Raider's in-game benchmark hit an unplayable 18 FPS average at 720p in lowest. The benchmark represents a worst case scenario though, so you could squeeze out some more frames in actual gameplay, and with some careful tweaking. Finally, The Witcher 3's turn. Exploring the beautiful map really takes its toll on the hardware, which can only pump out 16 FPS average with very noticeable stutter throughout. This is the only game that this APU absolutely cannot run unless you were to go completely low-spec gamer style and modify the game files. Overall, I've been very surprised by this APU performance. AMD is generally slammed for its Pre-Ryzen CPUs, but considering this processor's age and low price, I am impressed that it can play most games besides the most demanding ones. Considering that a motherboard can run for as low as 30 to 40 US dollars, and these APUs can often be found for less than 50. This would make for a great discrete office or home theater PC, since most FM2 motherboards are micro ATX, and these systems don't require any dedicated GPUs, as you just saw. If you're planning to pick up an APU for gaming, however, be sure to buy an A8 or A10 5000 series and above, and most ideally a K version for necessary overclocking on 4 cores. For most gamers out there though, I really wouldn't recommend buying into the FM2 socket, since it has really bad CPU support, unless you're in a very special group that plans to use AMD's very special dual graphics technology with your APU. I really wouldn't recommend buying into the socket unless you're on a really tight budget. Thanks for watching.